My brother raised his glass and announced to a room of 300 people that I was his loser sister who still lived with roommates. The crowd erupted in laughter while my parents beamed with pride. They had no idea that moments later, his new boss would walk through the doors, hug me, and say the exact words needed to destroy their perfect facade. My name is Monica, and I am 33 years old. I have spent the majority of my life standing in the shadows of my older brother Jason. Tonight was his wedding night, a lavish affair held at one of the most exclusive country clubs in the northern suburbs of Chicago. Every detail of the evening had been meticulously curated to project an image of absolute perfection and limitless wealth. Thousands of white orchids cascaded from crystal chandeliers that hung suspended over tables draped in heavy silk linens. Waiters in crisp formal attire moved silently through the room, ensuring that no champagne flute ever went empty. It was a six-figure spectacle, designed not just to celebrate his marriage to his new bride Ashley, but to serve as a monument to his perceived dominance in the corporate world. I sat near the back of the grand ballroom at a table populated by distant relatives and obligatory invites. My placement was no accident. My parents, Thomas and Barbara, had orchestrated the seating chart with the precision of military generals, ensuring that their golden child remained the focal point of the evening, while their greatest disappointment was kept safely out of the immediate line of sight. I wore a simple deep blue evening gown that I had selected myself, though the narrative floating around the room was quite different. I rested my hands in my lap, feeling the cool condensation on my water glass, and watched as the best man handed the microphone over to my brother. Jason stood at the center of the room, radiating the kind of arrogance that only comes from a lifetime of being told you are flawless. He was 35 years old, a high-level sales executive at a prominent software firm, and he carried himself as though he owned the very air in the room. He tapped his spoon against his crystal flute, and the low hum of conversation across the massive ballroom instantly fell silent. 300 faces turned toward him, filled with adoration and expectation. He began his speech with the usual platitudes. He spoke eloquently about his beautiful new wife, Ashley, painting a picture of their romance that sounded like it had been ripped straight from a cinematic screenplay. He paused to wipe a perfectly timed tear from his eye, drawing a collective sigh of admiration from the audience. Then he turned his attention to our parents. He raised his glass to Thomas and Barbara, thanking them for funding his extraordinary life, for paying his way through an elite out-of-state university, and for molding him into the aggressive, successful businessman he was today. I watched my parents as they basked in his praise. My father, Thomas, puffed out his chest, adjusting his expensive silk tie with a look of supreme satisfaction. My mother, Barbara, placed a manicured hand over her heart, tilting her head in that practiced, condescending way she reserved for moments of public triumph. They looked at Jason as if he were a deity they had personally sculpted from clay. And then, just as the applause for my parents began to die down, Jason shifted his posture. A familiar, cruel smirk touched the corners of his mouth. I recognized that look immediately. It was the same expression he wore when we were children, right before he was about to break one of my toys or blame me for his mistakes. And of course he said, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system, "I have to mention my little sister Monica." The spotlight operator, seemingly cued in advance, swung a blinding circle of white light directly onto my table. I blinked against the sudden glare, feeling 300 pairs of eyes instantly lock onto me. I did not shrink away. I sat perfectly straight, keeping my expression entirely neutral, even as my heart began a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. "Yes, there she is," Jason continued, his tone dripping with theatrical pity. "Meet my loser sister who still lives with roommates. At 33 years old, she is truly an inspiration to us all, proving that you can absolutely refuse to grow up." A ripple of awkward laughter drifted through the front tables, but Jason was not finished. He leaned into the microphone, his smile widening into a predatory grin. "I actually have to give a huge shout-out to our parents tonight. They had to take Monica shopping and buy her that dress just so she would not look like a beggar who wandered into a high-society event. We really could not risk her embarrassing the family on my big day now, could we?" The ballroom erupted. It was not just a few chuckles. It was full-throated belly laughter from hundreds of guests who felt entirely comfortable mocking a woman they hardly knew because the groom had given them permission to do so. The sound washed over me like a physical wave. I looked toward the head table expecting at least a fleeting moment of parental intervention. Instead, I saw my mother covering her mouth as her shoulders shook with laughter. My father lifted his champagne flute toward Jason in a silent salute of approval. They were completely complicit, reveling in my public humiliation as if it were the evening's main entertainment. I did not cry. I did not stand up and shout. I did not throw my drink or run out of the room in tears. Years of enduring their psychological warfare had forged an iron shield around my emotions. I simply picked up my water glass, took a slow, measured sip, and lowered it back to the table. The people seated next to me awkwardly averted their gaze, pretending to be fascinated by the floral centerpieces. As the laughter subsided and Jason transitioned back to boasting about his career, the murmurs from the neighboring tables reached my ears. The acoustics in the ballroom amplified the harsh whispers of the guests seated around me. Their hushed conversations provided a perfect summary of the false narrative my family had spent years cultivating. "Can you believe she still lives like a college student?" one woman whispered to her husband, adjusting her pearl necklace. "Jason is such a brilliant corporate star. I heard his firm was just acquired by Vanguard Acquisitions for a massive payout. He is about to be a vice president." Her husband nodded sagely, carving into his filet mignon. "It is a shame about the sister, though. Thomas told me she is just a freelance data entry clerk. She never amounted to anything. Just bounces from one failed idea to the next. It must be so hard for Barbara to have such a disappointment for a daughter when her son is practically running the tech industry." I listened to their assessments with a detached sense of clinical observation. The sheer confidence with which they discussed my supposed failures was almost impressive. My family had done an exceptional job of isolating me socially and painting me as the ultimate scapegoat. They had emptied my college fund years ago to buy Jason his first luxury car, forcing me to build my life entirely in the shadows. They assumed my silence over the past decade was a sign of submission and defeat. They believed I was exactly what they told everyone I was. But they were wrong. I had not been living with mere roommates, and I was certainly not a freelance data entry clerk. My family only saw what they wanted to see because they never bothered to look deeper. They never asked about the nature of my business or the identity of the people I lived with. I felt a sharp vibration against my leg. I reached into my small clutch purse and pulled out my phone, keeping it concealed beneath the edge of the silk tablecloth. The screen illuminated with a priority notification. It was a highly encrypted, secure message from Donovan. I opened the message and read the brief text. "Acquisition finalized. Arriving at the venue now." I locked the screen and slipped the phone back into my purse. A profound sense of calm settled over me completely, replacing the lingering sting of Jason's cruel toast. The music swelled as Jason finished his speech, raising his glass high into the air to a standing ovation. My parents stood clapping loudly, their faces radiant with pride for their golden child. The crowd cheered, completely unaware of the massive storm that had just breached the perimeter of the country club. I folded my hands in my lap, took another slow sip of water, and waited for the heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom to open. The heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom did not just open. They swung wide with a forceful thud that echoed over the gentle classical music playing from the string quartet. A sudden draft of cool air swept through the stiflingly warm room, causing the flames of the table candles to dance and flicker. Every head turned toward the entrance. A man stepped through the threshold. He was tall, with striking silver hair cut close to his scalp, and he wore a charcoal gray, bespoke suit that projected an aura of absolute authority. It was Donovan, the public-facing chief executive officer of Vanguard Acquisitions. He was the billionaire whose holding company had just finalized the buyout of the firm less than 48 hours ago. Up on the stage, Jason froze. I watched the blood completely drain from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very small. His mouth hung slightly open. The microphone he had been using to mock me slipped from his fingers and landed on the hardwood floor with a deafening screech of feedback that made half the guests cover their ears. He did not even bother to pick it up. Instead, he practically shoved his new bride aside and scrambled down the short flight of stairs. He nearly tripped over the hem of a dress in his desperate haste to cross the massive dance floor. He was smoothing his hair and adjusting his jacket lapels, acting like a panicked intern rather than a victorious groom. "Mr. Donovan?" Jason called out, his voice pitching upward with nervous excitement. He thrust his hand forward while he was still several yards away, practically jogging toward the entrance. "What an absolute honor, sir. We had no idea you were coming. Please let me have the staff set up a place for you at the head table." Donovan did not slow his pace. He did not look at Jason. He did not acknowledge the outstretched hand or the frantic groveling of the man whose career he now technically controlled. He walked right past my brother as if Jason were nothing more than a piece of decorative furniture. The utter dismissal was so jarring that a collective gasp rippled through the front tables. Jason stood frozen with his hand extended, his desperate smile dissolving into a mask of pure confusion. Donovan continued his steady, measured stride straight down the center aisle. He bypassed the wealthy executives, the local politicians, and the high society friends my parents had invited to pad their own egos. He walked past the towering floral arrangements and the crystal champagne fountains, heading directly toward the dimly lit back corner of the ballroom. He was heading directly toward me. The murmurs in the room died down entirely. The silence became thick and heavy. I remained seated, keeping my posture relaxed and my hands resting gently in my lap. When Donovan reached my table, the distant relatives seated around me practically shrank back into their chairs. He stopped right in front of me and buttoned his suit jacket. Then, to the absolute shock of the 300 people watching, he bowed his head in a gesture of profound respect. He reached out and pulled me into a warm, familiar hug. "I am so sorry I am late," he said. He did not whisper. He projected his voice perfectly, ensuring that the sound carried across the dead silent room. The final transition paperwork for the acquisition took much longer than expected, boss. The word hung in the air like a physical weight. For several agonizing seconds, nobody moved or breathed. The complete absence of sound in that massive ballroom was deafening. I looked over the shoulder of Donovan toward the front of the room. My brother looked as though he had been struck by lightning. His eyes darted frantically between Donovan and me, trying to process a reality that completely shattered his worldview. Then the denial set in. Jason let out a loud, high-pitched laugh that sounded completely unhinged. He marched back toward the center of the room, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Are you kidding me right now?" Monica Jason shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. "This is pathetic. Did you seriously hire an actor to come in here and pretend to be my new chief executive officer? You hired a lookalike just to save face because I called you out. That is a new low even for you." The guests began to murmur among themselves, eager to accept this explanation. It was much easier for them to believe that the spinster sister was a desperate liar than to accept that they had just mocked the owner of a billion-dollar holding company. Before Donovan could correct him, my mother descended upon my table like a bird of prey. Barbara practically materialized out of thin air, her face flushed an ugly shade of crimson. She leaned down, and her perfectly manicured fingers dug into my upper arm with surprising viciousness. Her nails bit through the thin silk of my evening gown. "What is wrong with you?" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper meant only for my ears. "How dare you pull a stunt like this on your perfect day? You are sick, Monica. You are a jealous, bitter little girl. I want you out of this country club immediately before you cause any more permanent damage to this family." I looked down at her hand gripping my arm. Then I looked up into her furious eyes. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or try to explain. There was no point in arguing with people who were so deeply committed to their own delusions. "Take your hands off me," I said quietly. The absolute authority in my tone made her recoil. She snatched her hand back as if she had been burned, staring at me with a mixture of shock and lingering rage. I stood up smoothly, smoothing out the fabric of my dress. I gave Donovan a slight nod indicating that we were leaving. I did not look back at my mother. I did not look at my father, who was standing frozen near the stage. I certainly did not look at Jason, who was still pacing and laughing nervously, trying to convince his new bride that this was all just a pathetic prank. I turned and walked calmly down the center aisle, holding my head high. Donovan walked a half step behind me, a silent guardian reinforcing the reality they were all desperately trying to reject. The guests parted like the Red Sea as we approached the exit, refusing to make eye contact with me. I pushed open the heavy double doors and stepped out into the cool evening air, leaving the stifling toxicity of my family behind. A sleek black chauffeured car was idling under the portico of the country club. The driver immediately stepped out and opened the rear door for me. I slid into the luxurious leather seat, taking a deep, cleansing breath. Donovan closed the door, securing me in the quiet sanctuary of the vehicle. As the car glided forward, leaving the opulent country club in the rearview mirror, my phone vibrated in my clutch. I pulled it out and opened the encrypted application. Donovan had just transmitted a highly classified internal file. I tapped the screen to open the document. The message was brief but devastating. Audit complete. Jason did not just overspend on this wedding. He embezzled $2.5 million from the firm to pay for it. Awaiting your execution orders. I stared at the glowing letters in the darkened cabin of the car. My brother had stood on a stage and called me a beggar while he funded his entire extravagant lifestyle with stolen money. I locked my phone screen and looked out the window at the passing city lights, feeling a cold smile slowly form on my face. The total and complete destruction of his perfectly fake corporate world was finally about to begin right now today. For several minutes after the country club disappeared behind us, neither Donovan nor I spoke. The partition between the driver and the rear cabin was raised, leaving us inside a sealed pocket of silence. I reopened the preliminary audit on my phone and studied the first page again. The figure was not an estimate. $2.5 million had been diverted through a chain of vendor payments disguised as transition expenses. Some of those vendors were directly connected to the orchids, the imported champagne, the private transportation, and the luxury accommodations surrounding Jason's wedding. Donovan finally broke the silence. "We can suspend him before midnight," he said. "Legal has enough to lock his corporate credentials and preserve the accounts. If you want security waiting at his house when he returns from the reception, I can arrange it." "Not yet," I replied. He turned toward me but did not question the decision. Donovan had worked beside me long enough to understand that patience was never hesitation. It was strategy. Jason had spent his entire life escaping consequences by creating confusion. Whenever he was caught lying, he produced a louder accusation. Whenever he stole something, he convinced our parents that I had misplaced it. If we confronted him with an incomplete file, he would immediately destroy evidence, blame a subordinate, and use my name as a shield. I was not interested in giving him that opportunity. Preserve every server, every device, and every financial account connected to his department, I said. Do not alert him that the investigation is criminal. Let him believe the acquisition review is routine. I want the complete chain before he realizes we are looking. Donovan nodded and sent the instruction through the encrypted system. Within seconds, Vanguard's compliance division began creating silent forensic copies of Jason's corporate laptop, email archive, expense reports, and access logs. Nothing disappeared from his screen. Nothing warned him that every movement was now being duplicated and stored beyond his reach. Back at the country club, Jason was trying to rebuild the illusion I had left in pieces. The moment the doors closed behind Donovan and me, he grabbed the fallen microphone from the floor and forced another laugh into the sound system. He told the guests they had witnessed an embarrassing stunt arranged by a jealous sister. He claimed the man who had entered the ballroom was an actor hired from a corporate entertainment agency. His voice grew louder with every sentence, but the laughter did not return. Several executives near the front tables had recognized Donovan immediately. One of them quietly pulled up a business article on his phone and showed the photograph to the people seated beside him. Another guest searched Vanguard's official leadership page. Whispers spread across the ballroom faster than Jason could talk over them. Ashley stepped down from the stage and caught his arm. She asked why the supposed actor had arrived in a chauffeured company vehicle and why two members of Vanguard's transition team had followed him into the country club lobby. Jason pulled away and told her not to question him in public. His smile remained fixed for the guests, but his jaw tightened with panic. My parents rushed to support him. Barbara announced that I had always suffered from delusions of importance. Thomas told anyone willing to listen that I probably spent my last few dollars arranging the performance because I could not tolerate Jason's success. Their explanation gave some guests permission to relax, but it did not erase what they had seen. The room never recovered its earlier energy. Conversations became guarded. Several of Jason's new colleagues left before dessert, without offering congratulations. Jason escaped into a private corridor near the kitchens and opened his corporate email. A new acquisition notice was waiting. It informed all senior employees that records connected to transition expenses were being placed under mandatory preservation, and that deletion or alteration of files would result in immediate disciplinary action. The message had been distributed to dozens of managers, but Jason read it as though it had been written directly to him. He immediately called Martin, his former division president. The call went to voicemail. He tried the finance director next and received no answer. Then he opened the banking application linked to the dormant limited liability company we had once shared. The account still appeared active. The fraudulent transfers were still visible only through the false descriptions he had created. For the moment, nothing looked frozen. That small detail restored some of his confidence. He convinced himself the preservation order was standard acquisition bureaucracy. He told himself Donovan had ignored him only because the billionaire had been manipulated by my performance. Most importantly, he believed I remained unaware that my old company had been used in his financial trail. By the time he returned to the ballroom, he had already begun constructing a plan to secure my signature and place the final liability in my name. While Jason reassured himself, I arrived at my penthouse through the private underground entrance. Diana was waiting in the main conference room with 3 members of our forensic accounting team and 2 corporate attorneys. The city glittered beyond the glass walls, but nobody looked at the view. A secure monitor displayed the preliminary map of transactions recovered during the acquisition. I changed out of my evening gown and returned wearing dark trousers and a plain silk blouse. The transformation felt less like changing clothes and more like stepping out of the role my family had assigned me. I took the chair at the head of the table and asked the team to begin. The lead accountant explained that Jason had hidden personal expenses inside acquisition-related consulting invoices. The wedding vendors were only the most visible layer. Beneath them were transfers divided into smaller amounts routed through temporary companies and accounts controlled by people connected to him. One branch of the trail touched the dormant company bearing my name, but the final authorization remained incomplete. That was the opening Jason would try to close. "He needs my signature," I said. The attorney beside Diana nodded. Without it, the records show that he accessed an inactive entity without the majority owner's authorization. With a new signature, he could argue that you approved the recent filings, an attempt to shift responsibility for the account activity. Donovan placed both hands on the table. "Then we wait for him to ask." "Exactly," I replied. "Do not contact him. Do not accuse him. Let him decide how much more evidence he wants to create." Diana began assigning tasks. One team would verify every vendor connected to the wedding. Another would trace the corporate credentials used for each transfer. Legal would secure court-ready preservation orders without serving them until I gave the command. The process was quiet, precise, and entirely invisible to the people still celebrating at the country club. Near midnight, my phone began filling with messages from relatives. Some demanded an apology. Others asked whether Donovan was really my employer. Barbara left 3 furious voicemails ordering me to admit the prank before I destroyed Jason's promotion. Thomas threatened to cut me out of the family if I did not return to the club and publicly retract everything. I deleted none of them. Every message was another record of what they believed and how far they were willing to go to protect him. Just before dawn, the first consolidated report appeared on the conference screen. It did not yet contain every answer, but it confirmed the central fact. Jason had used Vanguard resources to finance the image of success he displayed to the world, and he had begun positioning my identity between himself and the missing money. I closed the report and looked around the table. No one moves against him until we know the entire structure, I said. But from this moment forward, every call, every document, and every demand he makes is evidence. The team understood. The room returned to work as the first gray light spread over Lake Michigan. Jason believed the wedding ended with him humiliating me. In reality, it ended with him becoming the subject of the most thorough investigation of his life. 2 days passed since the wedding reception. I spent those 48 hours inside the secure walls of my city penthouse, working closely with Donovan and our forensic accounting team. We meticulously traced every single fraudulent wire transfer Jason had authorized during the final weeks leading up to his firm's acquisition. The sheer audacity of his embezzlement was staggering, but I remained entirely focused on the corporate execution strategy we were building. I was reviewing a series of offshore bank statements when my private intercom buzzed softly. My personal assistant Diana stepped into my office holding her tablet with a look of mild amusement. She informed me the property manager at my former address was on the line in absolute panic. My parents, Thomas and Barbara, were standing in the lobby of a crumbling apartment building on the south side of the city, screaming at the front desk clerk. They were demanding to be let into my unit. It was the same modest, rundown apartment they had reluctantly co-signed for me a decade ago. They were completely unaware that I had moved out of that dilapidated building 5 years ago. They had never once bothered to visit me when I actually lived there. I told Diana to have my driver bring the car around. I could have easily sent private security to remove them from the premises, but I wanted to see exactly how far their delusion stretched. I changed into a simple dark trench coat and sunglasses, deliberately downplaying my appearance before stepping into the back of my waiting vehicle. The drive to the south side took 20 minutes. The neighborhood was a stark reminder of the grueling poverty I had endured while building my first company. When I stepped through the rusted double doors of the building lobby, I found my parents berating a terrified teenage receptionist. My mother, Barbara, was wearing a designer pastel suit that looked entirely out of place against the peeling paint of the lobby walls. She was slamming her hand against the reception counter, threatening to call the police if the clerk did not hand over the spare key to my apartment. My father, Thomas, stood right behind her, with his arms crossed over his chest, projecting an aura of impatient superiority. I cleared my throat loudly as I approached them. They spun around in unison, their faces instantly morphing from entitlement to aggressive fury the moment they locked eyes on me. "There you are!" My mother snapped, her voice echoing harshly in the cramped lobby. She marched toward me, closing the distance between us with heavy stomping steps. "How dare you ignore my phone calls for 2 days, Monica? We have been waiting in this filthy, disgusting lobby for 20 minutes. You are going to take us up to your miserable little apartment right now. We need to have a very serious conversation about your behavior at the country club." I did not flinch or take a step back. I kept my hands buried deep in the pockets of my trench coat. "I do not live here anymore," I said, keeping my voice low and perfectly even. "I have not lived in this building for half a decade. What exactly do you want from me?" My father stepped forward, crowding into my personal space. "Do not use that disrespectful tone with your mother," he warned, pointing a thick finger directly at my face. "You owe this family a massive apology, Monica. You hired some ridiculous impersonator to crash your brother's wedding just to make yourself feel important. You embarrassed Jason in front of his new colleagues and completely humiliated us in front of our friends. You ruined his perfect day because you could not handle the fact that he is successful and you are a complete failure." My mother nodded vigorously in agreement, her face twisting into a sneer of pure contempt. "You are selfish, Monica. You have always been selfish. Jason is under an immense amount of corporate stress right now, trying to secure his promotion at the new company. He and Ashley had to tap into their savings to pay for the damages your little stunt caused at the venue. So you are going to make it right. You are going to go to the bank right now and withdraw whatever measly savings you have managed to scrape together from your freelance jobs. You are giving that money to Jason to help cover the rest of his honeymoon costs. You owe your brother. He has always looked out for you while you bounced from one useless business venture to the next. We poured our resources into Jason because he had a future in the corporate world. We knew you would never amount to anything with your internet projects. That is exactly why we drained your college fund to buy Jason his first luxury car when he got his junior executive position. He needed to look the part to succeed. The lobby fell completely silent. I felt a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. I had suspected they emptied my trust account before my freshman year, forcing me to take on crushing debt and work 3 jobs just to survive. Hearing her admit it so callously, as if it were a simple practical business decision, finally severed any remaining thread of familial loyalty I held in my heart. "You stole my college tuition to buy Jason a car," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Do not use the word steal," my father snapped, looking momentarily uncomfortable before his arrogance returned. "It was family money, Monica. We distributed it where it would yield the highest return on investment. Jason is a rising star. It was a strategic decision. Now, are you going to give us the money for his honeymoon, or do we need to officially disown you and cut you out of this family forever?" Before I could formulate a response, my phone vibrated in my coat pocket. I pulled it out and glanced at the glowing screen. It was a text message from Jason. "Hey, Monica," the text read, adopting fake brotherly sympathy. "Mom and Dad said they are coming to see you. I know things got a little crazy at the wedding, but I am willing to forgive and forget. I know you are struggling to make rent this month. I want to help you financially. I can send you a few $1,000s today if you just do me a quick favor. I need you to sign a few routine tax documents for that old limited liability company we used to share. My new corporate bosses are doing a background check, and I need to close out some old paperwork. Let me know when you can sign." I read the message twice, absorbing the full weight of his manipulative strategy. He was actively trying to frame me. The dormant company he was referring to was a basic legal entity I had created years ago when I first started taking freelance design clients. Jason had been a co-signer on the original bank account. He knew the Vanguard Acquisitions auditors were closing in on his $2.5 million embezzlement. He needed my electronic signature on those tax documents to finalize the transfer and officially make me the primary scapegoat for his massive federal crime. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, allowing a tight smile to touch my lips. My parents were still glaring at me, expecting me to crumble under the weight of their disappointment, just as I had done 1,000 times before. I looked up from my pocket, meeting my mother's furious gaze, with a calm that clearly unnerved her. "Speak of the devil," I said, my voice smooth and conversational. "Jason just sent me a rather interesting text message. He says he is willing to forgive my behavior at the wedding if I do him a quick financial favor." Barbara crossed her arms, her designer handbag swinging sharply against her hip. "Well, of course he is," she scoffed. "Your brother has a heart of gold, Monica. He is incredibly generous to even speak to you after the stunt you pulled. He is offering you an olive branch. You should be down on your knees thanking him for being the bigger person. What does he want you to do?" I kept my expression entirely neutral. "He wants me to sign some routine tax documents for an old limited liability company we opened together back in my 20s. He claims his new corporate bosses at Vanguard Acquisitions are running a background check, and he needs to close out the dormant account today." My father Thomas stepped forward, his posture instantly shifting from aggressive intimidation to commanding impatience. "Then you need to sign those documents right this second," he demanded. "Do not make him wait." "Monica, Jason is dealing with billion-dollar transitions right now, and he does not have time for your typical delays. Pull the documents up on your phone and authorize them. This is the absolute least you can do to repay him for always looking out for you." I let out a slow, measured breath. "Looking out for me," I repeated, letting the words hang in the heavy air of the dilapidated lobby. "You mean like when he used my college fund to buy a sports car? Or do you mean right now when he is trying to use my name on old financial documents while undergoing a corporate audit?" My father's face darkened into a familiar mask of rage. "Do not start with your paranoid delusions again, Monica." He took another step toward me, pointing his finger inches from my chest. "You owe this family. You owe Jason. He has spent his entire life setting an example of excellence that you have continually failed to follow. Now he is asking for one simple signature to clear up some bureaucratic red tape. If you do not sign those papers right now, you are officially cut out of this family. We will disown you. We will make sure every relative, every family friend, and every contact we have knows that you maliciously tried to sabotage your brother's career. I stared at him, studying the absolute conviction in his eyes. He genuinely believed his threat held power. He had no idea that being cut out of this family no longer frightened me. What he called routine paperwork was clearly the final link in Jason's escape plan. The message had already revealed enough. He needed my name attached to the dormant company before Vanguard's review reached the disputed account. I did not need to explain that to my parents. Their eagerness to force my signature told me they had accepted Jason's story before hearing a single fact. Instead of arguing, I let them believe their threat was working while I decided how to turn his request into evidence. My mother stepped up beside my father, her expression hardening into a glare of sheer contempt. You heard your father, Monica. This is your last chance to be a productive member of this family. Sign the documents or you are dead to us. We will wash our hands of you completely. Do not be stupid. Jason is trying to help you out financially by throwing a few $1,000s your way for a simple signature. You are practically begging for rent money, and he is offering you a lifeline. Take it and sign the paperwork. I let the silence stretch for a long moment, allowing them to bask in their perceived victory. I feigned a look of quiet resignation, lowering my shoulders slightly to give them the illusion of submission. Fine, I said, my voice carefully stripped of any emotion. I will look at the paperwork. Barbara let out a loud, exasperated sigh of relief. Finally, she muttered, "It is about time you stopped being so difficult. Pull it up on your phone." I shook my head. I am not signing legal and financial documents on a tiny screen in the middle of a dirty lobby, I replied, maintaining my submissive facade. If Jason needs my signature on corporate tax forms, I need to review them properly on a secure computer. You can tell him to email the file, but I am going to read every single page before I authorize anything. My father rolled his eyes, letting out a sharp bark of laughter. You are going to review corporate tax documents, he mocked. What exactly are you going to look for, Monica? You do not know the first thing about corporate finance. You design cheap websites for local bakeries. Just sign the bottom line so we can be done with this. I stood my ground, looking him directly in the eye. I am not signing anything until I am sitting at my own desk, I insisted. If it is that urgent, you can bring the physical copies to my home or wait for me to review the digital files on my own monitors. Those are my terms. If Jason is in such a desperate hurry, you two can come over and watch me sign them. Barbara threw her hands up in the air, looking around the peeling wallpaper and stained carpet of the apartment building lobby. We are not trekking up to your miserable little studio apartment, she snapped, brushing invisible dust off her pastel suit jacket. This building smells like old cabbage and despair. Just go upstairs and do it. We will wait in the car. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my keys. I do not live upstairs, I said casually. I moved out of this building 5 years ago. My parents froze. Their expressions went completely blank as they processed this new information. They had co-signed the lease for this apartment a decade ago and simply assumed I had been stuck here ever since. The fact that they had not known my address for half a decade was a glaring testament to their complete lack of interest in my life, but neither of them seemed capable of grasping that reality. What do you mean you do not live here? My father demanded, his brow furrowing in confusion. Where do you live? I pulled out one of my elegant, heavy cardstock business cards from my wallet. I flipped it over and grabbed a sleek silver pen from my inner coat pocket. I quickly jotted down my actual home address on the back of the card. I handed it out toward my mother. If you want me to sign Jason's documents, you can meet me here, I said, my voice perfectly steady. I will be home in an hour. Bring whatever paperwork Jason thinks he needs me to authorize. But I promise you, I am going to read every single line. Barbara snatched the card from my hand, her eyes narrowing suspiciously as she read the handwritten address. She stared at the paper for a long moment, her mouth parting slightly in confusion. My father leaned over her shoulder to read the address, and I watched his eyes widen. This is in the Gold Coast district, my father said, his voice dropping an octave as he recognized the city's most exclusive, ultra-wealthy zip code. This address is right in the middle of the luxury high-rises on the lakefront. What kind of game are you playing, Monica? You do not live in the Gold Coast. I adjusted the collar of my trench coat, giving them a faint, enigmatic smile. Like I said, I moved out of this building a long time ago. If Jason wants his signature, you know where to find me. I will be expecting you. I turned on my heel and walked toward the rusted double doors of the lobby, leaving them standing in stunned silence. As I pushed out onto the bustling city sidewalk, I knew exactly what they were thinking. They were assuming I was renting a converted closet or perhaps working as a live-in maid for someone incredibly wealthy. Their minds simply could not comprehend a reality where I was successful. That arrogant blindness was going to be their ultimate downfall. I climbed into the back of my waiting chauffeured car, ready to welcome them to my world. The drive back to the Gold Coast took barely 20 minutes, but it gave me enough time to shed the heavy trench coat and step fully back into my actual reality. By the time I walked out of my private elevator and into the expansive foyer of my penthouse, I felt a profound sense of tranquility. The sprawling $14 million residence occupied the entire top floor of the high-rise, offering an uninterrupted panoramic view of Lake Michigan and the city skyline. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the kitchen island and stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, waiting for the inevitable spectacle to unfold downstairs. This was the moment I had been preparing for ever since they ambushed me in that crumbling lobby on the south side. My property was heavily guarded. A building of this caliber did not just let anyone wander into the lobby, let alone up to the penthouse suites. I knew exactly how the interaction at the front desk was going to play out. I had specifically instructed my staff not to turn them away, despite their abrasive and highly predictable behavior. Less than an hour later, my private intercom buzzed. It was David, the head of building security. He sounded highly unamused. "Miss Monica, I have a Thomas, Barbara, and Jason claiming you invited them here. They were arguing with the valet about parking their vehicle and are currently demanding to use your private elevator. They seem to think there has been some sort of mistake with the address." I smiled at the predictable arrogance in his description. "Send them up, David. And please have 2 of your guards escort them directly to my doors. I want to make sure they do not get lost." I could only imagine the suffocating silence in that elevator car as they were flanked by 2 armed security guards dressed in tailored black suits. They had driven from the crumbling South Side apartment to the epicenter of Chicago wealth, assuming I was playing some kind of elaborate prank. As the digital numbers above the elevator doors ticked upward, climbing higher and higher into the exclusive tiers of the building, their confusion must have been rapidly morphing into defensive panic. The heavy steel doors of the private elevator slid open with a soft chime, stepping directly into my expansive marble foyer. My parents and brother stood frozen inside the car, hesitating to step out onto the imported tile. Jason looked completely out of his element. He was clutching a manila folder to his chest, holding the fraudulent tax documents he was so desperate for me to sign. He looked around the massive, sun-drenched living room, taking in the custom modern art, the sweeping staircase, and the endless expanse of glass overlooking the water. His eyes were wide, darting from the vaulted ceilings to the polished surfaces, trying to make sense of a space that cost more than his entire corporate division. My mother was the first to step out, her heels clicking sharply against the stone floor. She looked around with a mixture of sheer greed and intense suspicion. "What on earth is this, Monica?" my father demanded, stepping out behind her. He tried to puff out his chest, but the imposing presence of the 2 security guards standing perfectly still by the elevator doors clearly intimidated him. "Did you give us the address to a hotel? Are you house-sitting for somebody right now? We do not have time for these games. Jason has a massive corporate transition to manage today." I remained standing by the kitchen island, leaning casually against the cool quartz surface. "I am not house-sitting," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the vast open space. "This is where I live." You said you wanted to bring the paperwork to my home. So welcome to my home. I built this space from the ground up without a single cent of your help. Jason let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh, gripping his folder tighter. Right. You expect us to believe you own a $14 million penthouse in the Gold Coast. You design local bakery websites, Monica. You literally wore a dress to my wedding that Mom and Dad had to buy for you. I did not buy that dress, I replied smoothly. My stylist chose it because it met the specific country club dress code you demanded on your invitations. But you are welcome to believe whatever makes you feel comfortable, Jason. Just then, the discreet door leading to the west wing of the penthouse opened. Diana, my elite, live-in personal assistant, walked into the main living area. She was dressed in sharp professional attire, holding a sleek silver tablet. Right behind her emerged Wyatt, my private chef, wiping his hands on a pristine white apron, having just finished prepping the afternoon meal. Diana stopped when she saw the uninvited guests, her expression remaining perfectly neutral and professional. She walked over to me and handed me the tablet. The encrypted files you requested from the Vanguard transition team are fully downloaded and ready for your review, boss. Diana said quietly but clearly enough for my family to hear. Every single document has been cross-referenced. Wyatt has also prepared the organic salmon salads for lunch whenever you are ready. Thank you, Diana, I said, taking the tablet. And thank you, Wyatt. That will be all for now. My family stared at Diana and Wyatt, as if they were alien beings. My mother looked from Diana to me, her eyes narrowing as the gears in her head desperately tried to spin this into a narrative she could easily digest. Oh, my mother said, letting out a long breath of sudden comprehension. Her face relaxed into a smug, knowing smile. I understand now. These are your roommates. She turned to my father and Jason, gesturing toward Diana and Wyatt as if she had just solved a complex puzzle. Do you remember what Jason said in his toast at the wedding? Monica still lives with roommates. She must be renting a small closet or a servant quarter from these wealthy people. They probably let her stay here at a discounted rate in exchange for doing their data entry and running their little errands. Jason let out a heavy sigh of relief, his shoulders visibly dropping. Wow, Monica, he muttered, shaking his head in disgust. You actually had us going for a second. I thought you had somehow scammed your way into a luxury lease. But you are literally just a glorified maid for a couple of rich yuppies. This is honestly even more pathetic than the South Side apartment. Diana and Wyatt both looked at me, their professional composure barely masking their absolute bewilderment at my family's staggering delusion. It was almost comical to witness. I gave them a subtle nod, and they quietly retreated back to their respective quarters, leaving me alone with the three people who were currently digging their own graves. My mother stepped further into the living room, running her hand longingly over the back of a custom-imported Italian leather sofa. Her eyes were alight with greedy calculation. She looked around the multi-million-dollar space, evaluating the artwork and the high-end finishes, as if trying to calculate exactly how much money my supposed roommates possessed. Well, since your friends clearly have an absurd amount of disposable income, Barbara said, turning back to me with a sharp, commanding look. This actually works out perfectly for us. Jason is dealing with some unexpected corporate debts related to his promotion and the wedding venue damages. She took a step closer to the kitchen island, her tone shifting into a demanding, authoritative bark. I want you to go back in there and ask your rich roommates for a loan. You have obviously been doing their dirty work and fetching their groceries for a while now. They owe you a favor. Tell them you need $2.5 million. With a place like this, they probably have that kind of cash sitting around in a mutual fund somewhere. My father nodded emphatically, standing beside Jason. Exactly. You can finally do something useful for your brother. Get the money from your friends, and Jason will let you sign those tax documents so you can still be a part of his old limited liability company. It is a win-win situation. Now, go ask them, Monica. We do not have all day to stand around in your rented living room. I looked at the three of them standing in the center of my home, entirely consumed by their own arrogant assumptions. They were so blinded by their need to see me as a failure that they could not even perceive the reality staring them directly in the face. They thought I was a desperate servant begging for scraps in a palace I actually owned. I slowly set Diana's tablet down on the smooth, cool quartz counter, taking a deep breath to steady myself. I reached under the island and pulled out a sleek black leather folder. It was the same folder Donovan had handed to my security team earlier that morning, containing the fully completed forensic audit of Jason's department. I walked around the kitchen island, closing the distance between myself and my family. I did not raise my voice. I did not try to correct their ridiculous assumptions about my living situation. There was a much more pressing matter to attend to. I stopped right in front of Jason, looking directly into his panicked eyes, and extended my right hand holding out the sleek black folder. "I do not need to ask my roommates for a loan," I said, my voice dropping to a calm, chilling register. "I do not need to ask anyone for anything, but you should probably look at the digital footprints Jason left on my servers." Jason stared at the black leather folder in my outstretched hand, as if it were a highly venomous snake. For a fraction of a second, the arrogant mask slipped from his face, revealing the sheer, terrified panic underneath. He knew exactly what digital footprints I was talking about. He knew the Vanguard audit was closing in on him. But admitting that in front of our parents would mean the end of his golden child status. So he did what he had been trained to do his entire life. He completely denied reality. He let out a loud and incredibly derisive scoff, and then violently slapped the folder out of my hand. The heavy leather-bound document hit the quartz counter with a loud thud and slid onto the floor. "I am not looking at whatever garbage you printed out, Monica," he spat, taking a step back. "You are absolutely delusional. You think because you house sit for a couple of millionaires, you can suddenly talk to me like we are peers. I manage global tech accounts. You do not even know what a digital footprint is." My father quickly stepped between us, puffing out his chest to defend his son. "We came here to give you an opportunity to be a productive member of this family," he declared, his face flushed with indignation. "You stole a folder from your boss to try and intimidate your brother. You are sick in the head." Barbara grabbed my father's arm, casting a look of pure disgust around my kitchen. "Let us leave, Thomas," she said. "I cannot stand to be in this apartment for another second. She is clearly having another one of her mental episodes. We will tell the family she lost her mind. Jason, honey, do not let her stress you out. Your bosses will understand if you cut ties with a disturbed sibling." Jason nodded eagerly, adjusting his tie and refusing to look down at the folder on the floor. "Exactly, Mom. I am not wasting my valuable time on someone who squats in other people's homes and plays pretend. We are leaving." I watched them turn and march back toward the private elevator. They were so desperate to preserve their comfortable narrative that they willingly ignored the federal evidence lying right at their feet. I did not stop them or force them to look at the routing numbers. I simply watched the steel doors slide shut, sealing them inside their willful ignorance. They thought they had won. They had no idea they had just forfeited their last chance at mercy. The following morning, I sat at the oak desk in my home office sipping black coffee. I was reviewing the final acquisition integration files when Diana walked into the room. Her expression was carefully neutral, but her eyes held a sharp, protective intensity. "Boss, I think you need to see this," Diana said, placing her silver tablet on my desk. "It seems your brother has decided to escalate the situation publicly." I looked down at the screen. Jason and Ashley had launched an aggressive smear campaign across social media. Ashley posted a tearful video claiming I was a con artist. Sitting in her expensive suburban home, she spun a fabricated narrative for their corporate connections, claiming I had been secretly stealing money from our elderly relatives to rent luxury cars and pretend I lived in high-end city apartments to manipulate people into thinking I was successful. Jason shared her video, adding paragraphs of fiction. He claimed he tried helping me get psychiatric care for pathological lying, but I refused. He stated I was jealous of his corporate success and was trying to sabotage his marriage out of spite. The comments section was flooded with sympathetic messages. People praised Jason for being a supportive brother while condemning me as a toxic parasite. I read the posts with clinical fascination. Jason was panicked. Knowing the Vanguard audit was accelerating, he needed to establish a public paper trail, casting me as a desperate thief. He was laying the groundwork to explain why my name would be attached to his embezzled funds. By painting me as a criminal, he was hoping to destroy my credibility before I could expose his theft. It was a bold strategy, but it was also incredibly sloppy. Diana watched me read the posts, waiting for my reaction. I tapped the screen, pausing the video of Ashley sobbing about her ruined honeymoon funds. "This is quite a performance," I said, taking another sip of my coffee. "I assume you did not just bring this to me to ruin my morning. You found something in the back-end data." Diana offered a sharp, satisfied smile. "I did, boss. I immediately ran a deep diagnostic trace on the origin IP addresses. Your brother is not very good at covering his digital tracks." While Ashley uploaded the video from her mobile device, Jason logged into his accounts and boosted the posts using a very specific network. She reached over and swiped to the next screen on the tablet, revealing a highly detailed network routing log. "Jason did not use his home internet to post these defamatory statements," Diana explained, pointing to the highlighted data streams. "He used his secure Vanguard corporate network. He literally logged onto his company-issued laptop, accessed internal servers, and used Vanguard resources to launch a smear campaign." I set my coffee mug down, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction wash over me. The sheer arrogance of my brother was truly astounding. He was so desperate to frame me that he completely forgot the basic rules of corporate compliance. By using Vanguard servers, Jason elevated this from a petty family dispute to a severe breach of corporate conduct. He was using company assets to commit public defamation. Vanguard had strict zero-tolerance policies regarding the use of internal networks for personal harassment. As the incoming chief executive officer, I now possessed direct, undeniable evidence of his gross misconduct. "Secure these logs, Diana," I instructed, keeping my voice perfectly calm. "Download every single post, every comment, and every timestamp. Cross-reference the IP addresses with the Vanguard internal employee tracking system. I want an airtight legal package proving he utilized our corporate infrastructure to execute this smear campaign." "Consider it done," Diana said, retrieving her tablet. "Our legal team is already preparing the defamation paperwork. We will have him dead to rights on corporate misconduct before noon." I turned my chair to look out the massive window at the waking city below. Jason honestly thought he was firmly backing me into a corner. He thought he could use his shiny new corporate position to intimidate me and bend reality to his will. He believed that controlling the narrative on social media would somehow protect him from the federal audit closing in on his offshore bank accounts. He was playing checkers while I was finalizing a hostile takeover. I was going to let him continue digging his own grave. I wanted him to feel absolutely confident in his fabricated victory. I wanted my parents to feel secure in their choice to disown me. Because when the thick stone walls finally closed in around them, the shocking realization that they had willingly handed me the exact weapons needed to destroy their lives would be incredibly sweet. I settled back into my leather chair, opening the Vanguard transition files on my monitor, ready to review the next phase of his absolute ruin. Later that same afternoon, my cell phone vibrated violently against the polished wood of my massive office desk. The caller ID displayed my father's name in bold black letters. I let the phone ring 3 full times before sliding my thumb across the glowing screen to answer. His voice was uncharacteristically tight and strained, completely lacking his usual booming arrogance. He did not ask how I was doing or apologize for the horrific scene at the country club. Instead, he demanded that I meet him, my mother, and Jason at a grim, 24-hour diner located on the desolate outskirts of the city. He claimed there was a massive legal emergency regarding my late grandfather's estate that required my immediate physical presence. He spoke with a frantic urgency that immediately told me they were running out of options. I agreed to meet them, keeping my responses short and deliberately vague. I knew this was the exact next phase of their desperate scramble to avoid the massive corporate audit currently ripping through Jason's department. I grabbed my purse and signaled my security team that I was heading out. I arrived at the diner 30 minutes later, instructing my private driver to park the luxury vehicle around the back of the building, completely out of sight. The establishment smelled strongly of burnt filter coffee, old frying oil, and heavy industrial bleach. I spotted my family huddled together in a cracked red vinyl booth near the back of the restaurant, right beneath the flickering neon sign of the restroom hallway. Jason looked entirely frantic, constantly shifting his weight and biting his thumbnails to the quick. My mother Barbara clutched her faux leather handbag tightly against her chest, while my father Thomas hovered over a thick stack of legal-sized papers spread across the sticky formica table. They looked exactly like what they were, which was a group of desperate cornered criminals trying to plug the endless holes in a rapidly sinking ship. I approached their booth with slow, measured steps, letting them stew in their own mounting anxiety before making my presence known. The diner was mostly empty, providing the perfect isolated environment for their ambush. I slid into the booth opposite them, keeping my posture deliberately small and hunched to project a false sense of deep vulnerability. Before I could even ask why they had summoned me to such a depressing location, my father forcefully shoved the thick document across the table. It was a supposedly updated version of my grandfather's will accompanied by a binding quitclaim deed. Thomas coldly informed me that my grandfather had always intended to leave his vast commercial real estate portfolio entirely to Jason. He claimed a foolish clerical error had accidentally awarded me a 50% stake in the highly valuable properties. They demanded that I sign the quitclaim deed right then and there to correct the mistake and hand over my entire inheritance. My mother leaned forward over the table, her eyes narrowing into vicious, judgmental slits. She told me I was a complete parasite who had never earned a single dime in my entire miserable life. She hissed that I owed this property to Jason because my little stunts at the wedding had caused him severe emotional distress that threatened his brilliant career trajectory. Jason chimed in right on cue, his voice laced with a desperate kind of cruelty. He told me that his high-powered corporate lawyers at Vanguard Acquisitions were preparing to sue me into absolute oblivion. He openly accused me of being the criminal mastermind behind the missing $2.5 million from his firm. He aggressively claimed they had concrete proof that I had embezzled the funds to pay for my fake luxurious lifestyle in the city. He leaned across the table, invading my personal space, and said if I refused to sign over my inheritance immediately, he would personally see to it that I spent the rest of my life rotting in a federal prison. I realized right then in that suffocating little diner booth that my family was entirely coordinating to destroy my life and rob me blind. They were perfectly willing to frame me for a massive felony just to protect Jason from the undeniable consequences of his own massive corporate theft. They wanted me to fall on the sword. I did not argue with them. I did not raise my voice or point out the absolute absurdity of their empty threats. I knew that fighting back would only make them defensive and closed off. Instead, I played the exact role they expected me to play. I let my hands tremble slightly as I reached out and picked up the heavy legal documents. I widened my eyes, pushing my shoulders down to appear absolutely terrified and deeply submissive. I looked at Jason with manufactured fear pooling in my eyes. I told him I was incredibly confused and scared by all these complicated legal terms. I asked them to please explain exactly how the corporate money moved, because I simply did not understand anything about high-level corporate finance or complex offshore routing. I softly asked how they managed to get my grandfather to sign an entirely new will when his health and mental capacity had been so exceptionally poor during his final days in the hospital. I played the part of the naive, uneducated sister, flawlessly allowing their massive egos to completely take over the conversation as they fell directly into my trap. Intoxicated by their own massive arrogance and assuming I was far too stupid to understand the profound legalities of their actions, Jason and Thomas began to eagerly brag. They wanted to prove how brilliant and untouchable they were to the daughter they viewed as a failure. Jason openly detailed the exact mechanisms of his massive embezzlement scheme. He bragged about routing the stolen company funds through various offshore shell accounts, specifically detailing how he bypassed the internal corporate audits before trying to pin the final fraudulent transaction on my old dormant limited liability company. Thomas, not wanting to be outdone by his golden child, puffed out his chest and proudly admitted that forging my grandfather's signature on the quitclaim deed was incredibly easy. He laughed while explaining how he had simply traced an old signature from a birthday card 2 full days after the old man had already passed away. They laid out the entire framework of their federal crimes with terrifying casualness, completely convinced of their own invincibility. They genuinely believed their fabricated brilliance made them immune to any worldly consequences. I kept my head bowed, letting them continue their boastful, detailed confessions without a single interruption. I slowly reached for the cheap plastic pen resting next to the sugar dispenser, pretending to prepare myself to sign my entire life away. Underneath the sticky surface of the diner table, the tiny indicator light on my smartwatch blinked a steady, rhythmic green. Every word of their arrogant, detailed confession was being recorded in crystal clear, high-definition audio. The file was already being transmitted directly to my elite legal team and the Vanguard corporate compliance officers waiting on absolute standby. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the stained surface of the table as my fingers closed around the cheap blue plastic pen. The ink inside was barely visible, and the plastic casing was cracked near the top, but it would serve its purpose perfectly. I took a short, shaky breath, ensuring my shoulders trembled just enough to convey utter defeat. I uncapped the pen and hovered it over the signature line of the fraudulent quitclaim deed. My father watched my hand with intense predatory focus. He tapped his thick index finger against the paper, urging me to hurry up. His eyes were wide with a greedy, desperate anticipation. I pressed the ballpoint against the rough paper and slowly signed my full legal name. I made sure my signature was perfectly legible, ensuring there could be absolutely no legal ambiguity regarding my supposed surrender. The moment the dark ink dried on the page, I had officially handed them the heavy rope they would soon use to hang themselves. I set the plastic pen down and pushed the thick stack of papers across the sticky table. Jason did not even wait for the documents to stop sliding across the formica surface. He snatched the thick packet from the table, clutching it to his chest as if he had just won the state lottery. A massive, unyielding grin broke across his face, completely erasing the frantic anxiety that had consumed him just moments before. "Well, it is about time, Monica," he said, letting out a loud, breathless sigh of sheer relief. "You finally managed to do something genuinely useful for this family, instead of just dragging us all down with your constant failures. I am actually surprised you figured out how to sign on the correct line without messing it up. This is going to make my transition at Vanguard Acquisitions so much smoother now that I do not have to worry about you trying to steal what rightfully belongs to me." My mother reached over the table and patted Jason affectionately on the arm. Her eyes darted toward me, filled with a toxic mixture of triumph and absolute disdain. She adjusted the strap of her faux leather handbag and offered me a tight, entirely fake smile that did not reach her cold eyes. "You should feel very proud of yourself today, Monica," she said, her voice dripping with extreme condescension and misplaced superiority. "This is exactly why we called you here tonight. Jason has an incredibly important corporate trajectory to maintain, and he cannot have his unstable sister causing unnecessary financial roadblocks. By giving him your unearned share of the estate, you are ensuring the family name remains highly respected in the business community." My father quickly gathered the remaining loose papers from the table and stuffed them into his heavy leather briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut with a loud, definitive click. "We will have our corporate lawyers file these immediately tomorrow morning," Thomas declared, his chest puffing out with restored arrogance. "Do not think this completely excuses your horrific and highly embarrassing behavior at the country club, Monica. You still have a massive amount of apologizing to do for that little stunt you pulled. But signing this deed is a decent first step toward repairing the immense damage you caused to your brother's reputation. If you keep your head down, stay completely out of our way, and focus on your little freelance jobs, we might consider letting you attend holiday dinners again next year. Assuming, of course, you can behave yourself and act like a normal, responsible adult instead of a dramatic child." I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap, portraying the image of a thoroughly broken and defeated daughter. I looked up at them with manufactured sadness pooling in my eyes, biting the inside of my cheek to keep my expression submissive. I softly asked if they could possibly give me a ride back to my apartment. I told them the city buses stopped running this far out past midnight, and I did not have enough money in my checking account to afford a private car service back to the south side. I wanted to give them one final opportunity to show even a microscopic shred of basic human decency before I completely destroyed their lives. Jason scoffed loudly, sliding out of the cracked red vinyl booth with a look of utter revulsion. Absolutely not, he snapped, smoothing the front of his expensive designer suit jacket. Ashley and I just had the interior of the new luxury sedan completely detailed this morning. I am not having you sit in the back seat and ruin the pristine leather with your cheap clothes. Plus, we really do not want your negative energy dragging down the mood on the ride home. We have a massive amount of celebrating to do tonight. My mother nodded in vigorous agreement, standing up and wrapping her expensive silk scarf tightly around her neck to ward off the diner chill. You can easily walk to the nearest train station, Monica, she instructed, pointing vaguely toward the dark, desolate highway outside the large diner window. A little fresh night air will do you good. Maybe the long walk will give you some quiet time to reflect on how incredibly fortunate you are that we even allowed you to help us today. Do not bother calling us tomorrow either. Jason has extremely high-level executive meetings at Vanguard Acquisitions early in the morning, and your father and I will be very busy helping him prepare for his massive upcoming promotion. Without another word, the three of them turned their backs on me. They marched down the narrow diner aisle, laughing and chatting amongst themselves, completely ignoring the exhausted waitstaff and the few remaining late-night customers. They did not look back even once to see if I was okay, or to check if I had a safe way home. They simply pushed through the heavy glass front doors and walked out into the night, leaving me sitting alone in a diner, believing they had successfully stolen my entire inheritance and framed me for a federal crime. I sat perfectly still in the booth, listening to the jingle of the diner doorbell fading into the quiet evening. I turned my head and looked through the greasy plate glass window. I watched my father Jason and my mother pile into a sleek black luxury sedan parked under the flickering yellow streetlights. Jason was practically bouncing on his heels as he slid into the driver's seat, waving the manila folder in the air like a magnificent stolen trophy. The powerful engine roared to life and the bright red taillights illuminated the dark, cracked asphalt as the car pulled away, speeding off toward the city and their impending absolute ruin. The exact moment their vehicle disappeared from my sight, I dropped the submissive facade entirely. My hunched posture straightened instantly, and the manufactured fear evaporated from my eyes, replaced by a cold, calculating calm. I reached under the table and tapped the digital face of my smartwatch, stopping the high-definition audio recording. I then pulled my phone from my coat pocket and opened my secure encrypted messaging application. I selected the direct priority line to Donovan and quickly typed out the final command. The bait is taken. They submitted the forged document. Freeze all of Jason's offshore accounts and initiate the hostile takeover of Thomas's assets. I hit send and watched the message status change to delivered. By forcing me to sign that fraudulent quitclaim deed and bragging about it on a recorded line, they had officially escalated their reckless actions from petty family theft to documented federal wire fraud. I slid my phone back into my pocket and left a $100 bill on the sticky table for the waitress. I stood up and walked out the back exit of the diner, stepping into the cool night air where my private driver was waiting silently in the shadows, ready to take me back to my penthouse. A full week passed since that miserable encounter at the diner. For 7 days, my brother Jason and his new bride Ashley lived in an absolute delusion of victory. They had flown out the very next morning for a lavish second honeymoon in Bora Bora, completely convinced they had successfully pinned a massive federal crime on me, while simultaneously securing our late grandfather's entire commercial real estate portfolio. They spent the entire week flaunting their supposed wealth across every social media platform available. My assistant, Diana, monitored their accounts and provided me with daily updates purely for our own strategic preparation. Ashley posted dozens of perfectly curated photos showing them lounging on the deck of a premium overwater bungalow that cost over $5,000 a night. She shared videos of them drinking expensive champagne on private sunset yacht charters and dining at exclusive island restaurants. Her captions were dripping with arrogant entitlement, bragging about how hard her husband worked and how they were finally enjoying the elite lifestyle they so richly deserved. Jason looked incredibly smug in every single picture. He genuinely believed he had outsmarted the Vanguard auditors, his family, and the federal government all at once. He thought he was completely untouchable. They returned to Chicago on a crisp Tuesday evening, riding a wave of manufactured triumph. They expected to step right back into their glamorous high society lives and prepare for Jason to be officially named a vice president at Vanguard. They decided to celebrate their return to the city by booking a table at one of the most expensive and exclusive steakhouses in the downtown financial district. It was a restaurant where a simple dinner for two could easily cost well over $1,000. The illusion held strong right up until the moment the waiter arrived at their table carrying a sleek black leather folder containing the final bill. Jason did not look at the total amount. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his heavy metal corporate credit card. He dropped it onto the small silver tray with a loud clatter, projecting the image of a man who had limitless funds at his disposal. The waiter offered a polite, practiced smile and walked away toward the payment terminal near the back of the dining room. Jason leaned back in his plush velvet chair, swirling the last few drops of his expensive vintage wine, and smiled at his new wife. He was completely oblivious to the massive storm that was about to hit him. Less than 5 minutes later, the waiter returned to the table. His previously warm professional demeanor had been replaced by an expression of extreme discomfort. He kept his voice low, trying to maintain the discreet atmosphere of the upscale restaurant. "I am incredibly sorry, sir," the waiter murmured, leaning in close to Jason. "But it appears your card has been declined. Would you happen to have another method of payment this evening?" Jason froze, his confident smile instantly vanishing. The color drained slightly from his tanned face. He let out a harsh, dismissive scoff, shaking his head as if the waiter had just told a terrible joke. "That is absolutely impossible," he snapped, snatching the heavy metal card from the silver tray. "There is no limit on this corporate account. You must have run it wrong or your machine is broken. Run it again and do it right this time." The waiter maintained his polite professional composure, though a hint of tension tightened his jaw. "I assure you, sir, I ran it twice. The system is functioning perfectly. The issuing bank has placed a hard freeze on the account. I cannot process the transaction. Do you have a personal card we could use instead?" Ashley shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clutching her designer handbag tightly against her lap. "Jason, what is going on?" she asked, her voice carrying a slight tremor of underlying panic. "I thought you said your new bosses approved all of your expense accounts before we left for the honeymoon." Jason shot her a sharp, warning look, silently demanding that she keep her mouth shut. He pulled out his leather wallet and began frantically digging through the various compartments. A fine sheen of nervous sweat broke out across his forehead. He produced a personal credit card and shoved it aggressively toward the waiter. "Fine," Jason hissed, his voice dripping with condescending venom. "Just use this one. The bank probably flagged the corporate card for international travel because we just got back from Bora Bora. It is a simple security measure. My personal account will cover it easily." The waiter took the personal card and walked away. Jason picked up his cloth napkin and dabbed at his forehead, trying to play off the intense anxiety suddenly radiating from his body. He forced a strained smile for Ashley. When the waiter returned for the third time, the situation escalated from uncomfortable to entirely humiliating. The waiter stood completely straight, looking down at Jason with an expression devoid of any residual warmth. "Sir, this personal card has also been completely declined," the waiter stated, his voice slightly louder this time, carrying to the neighboring tables. "I have been instructed by my manager to inform you that we need a valid form of payment immediately, or we will be forced to involve the authorities." The surrounding diners abruptly stopped their conversations and turned to stare at the commotion. Ashley let out a small gasp of pure horror, sinking lower into her chair. Jason looked like he was going to be physically sick as he pulled out his mobile phone, his fingers trembling violently as he opened his banking application to check his balances. The screen loaded, and the reality of his situation finally slammed into him with the force of a freight train. Every single account he owned was locked. His corporate expense accounts, his personal checking, his offshore holdings, and his joint savings were all displaying a bright red notification banner indicating a total asset freeze. The $2.5 million he had embezzled had been completely secured and locked down by my legal team and federal authorities. He had zero access to a single dime. Jason was forced to endure the ultimate humiliation of calling his father Thomas to beg for an emergency transfer just to pay for his dinner. He sat in the restaurant lobby for 45 minutes waiting for the funds to clear while completely avoiding eye contact with the disgusted restaurant staff. The moment they finally escaped the restaurant and climbed into their car, Jason's phone vibrated with a sharp, piercing notification sound. He pulled the device from his pocket, staring at the screen with wide, terrified eyes. It was an automated high-priority email sent directly from the Vanguard Acquisitions Human Resources Department. The message was brief, cold, and strictly professional. Effective immediately, your entire department has been placed under mandatory restructuring. All corporate access privileges, including physical building entry and network logins, have been temporarily suspended pending a comprehensive mandatory transition review. You are required to attend a formal hearing tomorrow at noon. Failure to appear will result in immediate termination and further legal action. Jason stared at the glowing screen, his breathing shallow and rapid. The elaborate house of cards he had spent months building had just collapsed entirely. He was officially locked out, and the execution had begun. The morning sun reflected brilliantly off the glass facade of the Vanguard Acquisitions headquarters as Jason strode through the revolving doors. He adjusted his custom Italian suit and checked his reflection in the polished marble pillars. Despite the humiliating credit card incident last night and the cryptic email regarding a transition review, his ego had already rationalized the entire situation. He convinced himself that the corporate freeze was simply a standard security protocol. The email about restructuring was obviously the board clearing out the old guard to make room for his promotion to vice president. He carried a sleek leather briefcase and a smile of absolute unearned confidence. He approached the automated security turnstiles where dozens of junior employees were swiping their badges and rushing to the elevators. Jason bypassed the standard line and walked directly toward the executive entry lane. He pulled his platinum access badge from his inner pocket and tapped it against the black scanner. Instead of the familiar, pleasant chime and the smooth parting of the glass barriers, the machine emitted a harsh, buzzing sound. A solid red light flashed aggressively across the scanner panel. Jason frowned and tapped the badge again. The angry buzz repeated, echoing loudly in the cavernous lobby. A few junior analysts turned their heads to look at him. Annoyance flared in Jason's chest. He slapped the badge against the scanner a third time, leaning his weight into the glass barrier. The barrier refused to yield. "Sir, I am going to need you to step back from the turnstile." The voice was deep and devoid of the deference Jason expected. He turned to find two large security guards flanking him. They were not the friendly lobby attendants who greeted him by name. These men wore dark suits with discreet earpieces and looked at Jason with professional detachment. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Jason demanded, his voice rising enough to attract stares from the crowd. "I am the incoming vice president. My badge is malfunctioning. I need you to override the gate so I can get to my office." The taller guard did not blink. "We know exactly who you are, Mr. Wilson. Your access privileges have been permanently revoked by Human Resources. You are instructed to come with us immediately. We can do this quietly or publicly. The choice is yours." Jason felt the blood drain from his face. The absolute certainty of his promotion shattered. He looked around the lobby and saw his colleagues watching the exchange with wide eyes and hushed whispers. The humiliation burned hot in his chest, but the underlying terror was stronger. He swallowed hard, adjusting his tie with a trembling hand, and gave a stiff nod. He walked between the two guards as they escorted him away from the executive elevators and steered him toward a bleak service corridor. They led him down a narrow hallway lit by buzzing fluorescent bulbs until they reached a heavy wooden door marked with a simple brass plaque that read "Transition Management." One of the guards opened the door and gestured for Jason to enter. The room was small, completely windowless, and painted a sterile institutional white. A cheap metal table sat in the center of the room, surrounded by three uncomfortable plastic chairs. Sitting directly in the middle of the table was a standard brown cardboard banker's box. Jason stared at the box, his heart hammering against his ribs. Inside, he could see his expensive gold pen set the framed photograph of his Bora Bora honeymoon and the crystal paperweight he kept on his desk. His office had already been completely packed up. Sitting behind the table was an older woman with severe wire-rimmed glasses and an expression of pure administrative boredom. She was the Senior Director of Corporate Compliance. "Please sit down, mister," Wilson, she instructed, pointing to the plastic chair opposite her. The two security guards stepped into the room and closed the heavy door, leaving Jason trapped in the suffocating space. He slowly lowered himself into the chair, his eyes darting frantically between the cardboard box and the compliance director. "What is the meaning of this?" Jason demanded, attempting to summon his usual arrogant bluster, though his voice shook noticeably. "Where is Martin? Where is the CEO? I was told there was a transition review meeting regarding my promotion today." The compliance director adjusted her glasses and folded her hands neatly on the table. "You were informed of a mandatory transition review, Mr. Wilson. You made the deeply flawed assumption that it involved a promotion. Effective at midnight, your entire department was dissolved. Your corporate accounts have been frozen and your employment contract is currently under severe review for gross misconduct and the unauthorized diversion of company assets." Jason felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. The offshore accounts, the $2.5 million. They knew. He opened his mouth to deny everything, to blame his sister, just as he had planned. But the words died in his throat as the compliance director raised a single hand to silence him. "Do not speak, Mr. Wilson. This is not a discussion or a disciplinary hearing. This is a formal summons. The new majority shareholder of Vanguard Acquisitions has called a mandatory high-level transition meeting at noon today in the main boardroom. You are required to be there. Furthermore, because the pending federal audit involves shares of company stock currently held by your parents, Thomas and Barbara Wilson, their presence is also legally required. If any of you fail to appear at exactly noon, the company will immediately hand over all internal forensic data to federal prosecutors. You have exactly 3 hours to ensure your parents arrive in the city." Jason felt the room spinning. The new majority shareholder. Federal prosecutors. The words hit him like physical blows. The compliance director pushed a printed map toward him. "You will remain in this room until 11:45. You may use your personal cellular device to contact your parents immediately. At 11:45, security will escort you directly to the boardroom." The director stood up, smoothed her skirt, and walked out of the small room, leaving Jason completely alone with the two silent security guards and his cardboard box. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, locking him securely in his windowless prison. Panic, absolute and unfiltered, finally consumed him. His hands shook so violently he nearly dropped his phone as he pulled it from his pocket. He scrambled to find his father's contact, feeling the white walls closing in. The line rang twice before Thomas answered, his voice booming and cheerful. "Jason, my boy, how is the new corner office today?" "Dad, listen to me," Jason said, his voice tight and breathless. "I need you and Mom to get dressed in your absolute best suits right now. You have to drive into the city and get to the Vanguard building before noon." Thomas sounded confused but intrigued. "To the city? What for, Jason? Is this about the big promotion?" Jason squeezed his eyes shut, gripping the phone until his knuckles turned white. He could not tell them the truth. He could not admit that his entire life was collapsing right before his very eyes. "Yes, Dad," he lied quickly, swallowing the rising bile in his throat. "It is just a small formality before I am officially named vice president. They want the whole family here to celebrate with me today." I lowered my phone and set it gently on the marble surface of my kitchen counter. The silence that followed Barbara's frantic rant was surprisingly peaceful. I stood there, letting the sheer magnitude of her delusion wash over me. She had sounded incredibly certain of her impending victory, absolute in her belief that my existence was about to be erased from their glamorous lives. She genuinely believed Jason was on the verge of becoming a powerful tech executive in Chicago. She thought her cruel ultimatum telling me to pack my bags would finally crush my spirit. Instead, it merely cemented my resolve. Her arrogant laughter echoed faintly in my memory, but it carried no weight anymore. The toxic strings tethering me to her expectations were completely severed. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling absolute calm settle into my bones. The trap was now perfectly set. I turned and walked toward my master bedroom. It was time to prepare for the final act of this corporate play. I opened my massive wardrobe, bypassing the casual sweaters my family expected. Today required absolute armor. I reached for a custom charcoal suit made of fine wool, pairing it with matching trousers and a crisp silk blouse. I dressed with deliberate movements, feeling the expensive fabric conform to my posture. I pulled my hair back into a sleek style, leaving my face unreadable. I slipped on black leather stilettos that clicked with authority against the floor. I checked my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back was not the submissive, terrified daughter from the diner. She was the apex predator they never saw coming. My smartwatch vibrated, confirming the auditors were standing by and compliance was waiting. Everything was on exact schedule. I grabbed my leather briefcase containing the undeniable proof of Jason's massive embezzlement and the fraudulent quitclaim deed. I rode the private elevator down to the secure underground parking garage, where my driver was already waiting beside my luxury vehicle. I slid into the plush leather back seat, enjoying the quiet hum of the powerful engine as we merged onto the bustling Chicago streets. The morning traffic was heavy, but I felt no impatience. I watched the towering glass skyscrapers slide past my tinted window, reflecting the bright morning sun. Every block brought me closer to Vanguard acquisitions and closer to the absolute destruction of the elaborate fantasy my family had so arrogantly constructed. While I rode in silence, my parents were undoubtedly putting on a spectacular performance of unearned wealth. Thomas and Barbara pulled up to the Vanguard Acquisitions headquarters in their leased luxury sedan, expecting a hero's welcome. Thomas tossed his keys to the bewildered parking attendant with an arrogant flick of his wrist, barking strict instructions about not scratching the pristine paint. Barbara stepped onto the wide concrete plaza, adjusting her expensive faux fur coat and looking up at the towering glass facade with greedy, hungry eyes. She truly believed she was about to walk into that building and be crowned the matriarch of a newly minted corporate dynasty. She hooked her arm through Thomas's elbow, projecting the image of extreme high society importance. They marched through the massive revolving glass doors with their heads held high, completely oblivious to the fact that they were willingly walking directly into a federal corporate slaughterhouse. They expected a red carpet, but instead they were about to hit a brick wall. The Vanguard lobby was a cavernous space of polished white marble, echoing with the busy footsteps of hundreds of corporate employees. Thomas approached the sleek reception desk, bypassing a small line of visiting contractors. He slammed his hand flat on the counter, demanding immediate attention from the young woman working the terminal. He loudly announced that he was Thomas Wilson, the father of the incoming Vice President Jason Wilson, and demanded to be escorted to the executive suites for the billionaire transition meeting. He puffed out his chest, expecting the receptionist to gasp in awe and fetch the company president. Barbara stood right behind him, offering a tight, condescending smile to the junior analyst staring at them. She loudly mentioned to Thomas how nice it would be when Jason finally redecorated the lobby to better reflect their elevated family status. The receptionist did not smile or offer deferential apologies. She simply picked up her phone and made a very brief internal call. Less than a minute later, two large security guards dressed in dark tailored suits approached the reception desk. They did not offer warm greetings or respectful handshakes. The taller guard looked at Thomas with an expression of complete stone-cold detachment. He bluntly informed my parents that they were expected upstairs and instructed them to follow him immediately. Barbara mistakenly assumed these men were a private escort sent specifically to honor their arrival. She preened under the attention, whispering to Thomas that the new billionaire buyer clearly recognized their importance to the firm's future. They followed the guards past the standard elevators and were led toward a restricted access bank reserved exclusively for top-tier executives and high-level security events. Thomas loudly bragged to the silent guards about Jason's brilliant business acumen, completely misreading the absolute silence of the men walking beside him. He genuinely thought he was impressing them with his tales of Jason's massive new offshore accounts and impending corporate promotions. The elevator ride up to the executive floor was suffocatingly quiet, but my parents remained entirely oblivious to the rising tension. The heavy steel doors opened onto a wide corridor lined with frosted glass walls and thick soundproof carpeting. Barbara strutted down the hallway, her expensive heels sinking into the plush floor, expecting to see catered breakfast spreads and smiling executives waiting to pop champagne. Instead, the corridor was stark empty and aggressively sterile. The security guards stopped in front of double mahogany doors bearing a brass plaque that simply read, "Main Boardroom." One guard opened the heavy door and gestured for my parents to step inside. Thomas adjusted his silk tie, puffing out his chest one final time before crossing the threshold with Barbara, right on his heels. They were fully prepared to greet the elusive billionaire buyer and secure their family's massive fortune. They stepped into the massive room, and the heavy wooden doors clicked firmly shut behind them. The boardroom was massive, featuring a long, polished mahogany table surrounded by 20 black leather chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying view of the Chicago skyline, but the atmosphere inside was freezing cold. There was no champagne, no smiling executives, and no catering spread. Sitting alone at the far end of the massive table was Jason. He looked absolutely horrific. His expensive designer suit was heavily wrinkled and massive patches of nervous sweat stained his underarms. His face was a sickly pale gray, completely drained of his usual golden boy arrogance. His hands were shaking so violently that he had to clasp them together on the polished wood surface just to keep them still. Sitting directly behind him were the two silent security guards who had originally escorted him from the windowless human resources room. The cardboard box containing his miserable personal belongings rested mockingly on the floor near his feet. He looked up when his parents entered, his eyes wide with absolute unfiltered terror. Ashley was already seated 2 chairs away from Jason. She had arrived separately after receiving a formal notice from Vanguard's legal department explaining that she was required to attend because several disputed expenses had been charged for her benefit. The confidence she had displayed throughout the honeymoon was gone. She held her designer handbag against her stomach and kept glancing at Jason as though she expected him to explain why 2 security officers were standing behind him and why his personal belongings had been packed into a cardboard box. Barbara barely noticed any of it. She crossed the room with a bright, triumphant smile and opened her arms toward Jason. "There is our future vice president," she announced loudly. "We came as quickly as we could. Your father told the valet this celebration might run all afternoon, so they should keep the car close." Jason did not stand to embrace her. He looked past his parents toward the closed glass doors at the far end of the room. His lips moved, but no words came out. Thomas mistook his fear for solemn corporate concentration. He placed a heavy hand on Jason's shoulder and gave it an encouraging squeeze. "Do not be nervous, son," he said. "Important men always test the people they are about to promote. Just remind them how much revenue you brought into the firm and how many weak managers you carried on your back." One of the security officers exchanged a brief glance with the other. Ashley lowered her eyes. Barbara finally noticed the cardboard box. She bent down and saw the framed honeymoon photograph in gold pens set inside. Her smile faltered for half a second. "Why are your things in a box?" she asked. Jason swallowed hard. "It is part of the transition," he said. "They are moving me to a larger executive office after the meeting." Security packed everything so the facilities team could prepare the new space. The lie came automatically but lacked its usual confidence. Thomas accepted it without hesitation. Barbara's smile immediately returned. "Of course they are," she said. "I told everyone at the country club that the new owners would recognize your value. Monica tried to ruin your wedding, but even she cannot stop this family from rising." At the sound of my name, Jason flinched. Ashley leaned toward him. "You told me last night that the account freezes were a travel security problem," she whispered. "Why did corporate legal order me here? Why are these men watching you?" Jason turned on her with a sharp glare. "Keep your voice down. This is a confidential restructuring meeting. Spouses are often included when executive compensation packages are finalized." That explanation made no sense, but Ashley wanted desperately to believe it. She sat back and tightened her grip on the handbag. At exactly noon, the side door opened. Donovan entered first, followed by the senior director of compliance and 3 corporate attorneys carrying sealed files. No one offered congratulations. No assistant brought champagne. The lawyers took seats along one side of the table, while Donovan remained standing near the presentation screen. Thomas immediately rose and extended his hand. "Mr. Donovan," he said with theatrical warmth. "Thomas Wilson, Jason's father. I want to personally thank you for recognizing the exceptional talent our family has produced. My wife and I made enormous sacrifices to prepare him for leadership." Donovan looked at the offered hand, but did not take it. "Please sit down, Mr. Wilson," he said. The lack of warmth finally unsettled Thomas. He lowered himself into a chair beside Barbara. She leaned toward him and whispered that billionaires were often socially awkward. The compliance director activated a recorder in the center of the table. A small red light appeared. "This meeting is being preserved in full," she said. "All statements made in this room may be shared with corporate counsel, regulators, and law enforcement. No one is required to speak without private legal representation. However, any false statement or attempt to destroy evidence after this notice may create additional liability." Barbara's smile disappeared. What liability, she demanded. "We were told this was a meeting about Jason's promotion." "No one from Vanguard made that representation," Donovan replied. Thomas slowly turned toward his son. Jason shifted in his chair. His mind was racing through every possible escape. He had spent the morning trapped in the compliance room, rehearsing a single defense. Monica had stolen the money. Monica had manipulated the dormant company. Monica had forged the digital records because she was jealous of him. It was the same strategy he had used since childhood, only now the consequences were federal. Donovan took a sealed black folder from one of the attorneys and placed it on the table without opening it. "Mr. Wilson," he said to Jason, "before the majority shareholder joins us, you are being given one opportunity to identify any unauthorized activity associated with your credentials, your department, or the transition funds." Jason stared at the folder. "Is this an internal review or a criminal investigation?" "That depends on the truthfulness of your answer," Donovan said. The room went silent. Jason glanced at his parents. Thomas gave him a firm, reassuring nod. Barbara mouthed the words, "Tell them about Monica." That was all the permission he needed. Jason pushed himself upright and straightened his wrinkled jacket. His hands were trembling, but his voice strengthened as he stepped into the familiar role of victim. "Yes," he said. "There was unauthorized activity. I discovered it myself, and I came prepared to help the company identify the person responsible." Ashley turned toward him in disbelief. "You told me there was no missing money." Jason ignored her. He opened his leather briefcase and removed the thick manila folder he had brought from home. The papers inside included fabricated transaction summaries, copies of the dormant company filings, and the fraudulent quitclaim deed from the diner. "I know your auditors found approximately $2.5 million missing from accounts connected to the acquisition," he continued. "I also know some transactions appear under credentials assigned to my department. But I did not steal that money. My sister Monica did." Barbara released a dramatic gasp as though hearing the accusation for the first time. "I knew it," she said. "I knew that girl was dangerous." Donovan did not react. The attorneys continued taking notes. Jason walked toward the center of the table and placed the folder in front of Donovan. "Monica has been financially unstable for years," he said. "She lives with roommates and survives on small freelance jobs. Recently, she began pretending to have access to wealthy people and corporate executives. She hired someone to impersonate Mr. Donovan at my wedding because she wanted to damage my reputation in front of my colleagues. The real Donovan stood less than 6 feet away listening without expression. Jason continued. Monica had access to an old limited liability company we opened years ago. She used that entity to route Vanguard money through shell accounts and finance the false lifestyle she has been displaying. When I confronted her, she became frightened and signed over her interest in our grandfather's property as partial restitution. He pulled the quitclaim deed from the folder and held it up. This document proves she knew she had committed financial crimes. She transferred the estate to me because she was afraid I would report her. Thomas leaned forward. My son is telling the truth, he said. Monica has always resented him. We tried to get her professional help, but she refuses to admit she has a problem. Barbara nodded vigorously. She has lied since she was a child. Jason spent his entire life protecting her, and this is how she repays him. Ashley stared at the document in Jason's hand. Her face had become increasingly pale. She had been at the diner only through Jason's version of events. She had never heard that the deed was connected to the missing corporate funds. Why did you not tell me any of this before the honeymoon? She asked. Because I was protecting you, Jason snapped. I did not want my criminal sister contaminating our marriage. The compliance director folded her hands. Mr. Wilson, did Monica personally possess your corporate password and authentication device? Jason hesitated. She must have obtained them somehow, he said. That was not the question, the director replied. Did you give her access? No. Did you ever observe her using your company computer? No, but she is skilled with technology. Did you report the alleged theft when you discovered it? Jason's eyes moved toward the folder. I was gathering evidence. Did you contact corporate security? I intended to. Did you notify law enforcement? I wanted to handle the matter discreetly for the sake of my family. Each answer weakened his story, but his parents continued nodding as though he were delivering a flawless presentation. Donovan finally looked down at the quitclaim deed. You are presenting this as proof of restitution, he said. Exactly, Jason replied quickly. Monica signed it voluntarily. My father and mother can confirm that she understood what she was signing. Thomas stiffened, but forced himself to speak. Yes, she understood. Barbara added that I had appeared calm and cooperative. The three of them had now placed their statements on a recorded corporate record without realizing how directly they contradicted the audio from the diner. One of the attorneys slid a legal pad toward Donovan. He glanced at the note and then returned his attention to Jason. You also provided financial routing logs, Donovan said. Jason eagerly removed another group of pages. These show the money passing through companies linked to Monica. Once your auditors compare them to the dormant account, they will see that I am completely innocent. He pushed the entire folder across the table. Donovan did not touch it. Jason's confidence faltered. Sir, I understand why this looks complicated, but I have protected Vanguard throughout this process. I exposed a criminal inside my own family. Once the company clears my name, I am prepared to lead the restructured division and repair the damage she caused. Thomas smiled proudly. That is exactly the kind of loyalty Jason brings to an organization. No one responded. The silence became so complete that the faint mechanical hum of the ventilation system sounded loud. Jason's smile slowly collapsed. He looked from Donovan to the compliance director and then to the closed doors. Where is the majority shareholder? He asked. On the way, Donovan said. Jason wiped his palms against his trousers. I would prefer to explain the evidence before anyone forms the wrong impression. You have already explained it, Donovan replied, in considerable detail. Barbara leaned forward impatiently. Then perhaps you should review the folder and clear up this misunderstanding before the owner arrives. My son has been humiliated enough. Donovan slowly raised his left wrist and checked the time on his silver watch. The gesture was calm, deliberate, and completely devoid of concern. Jason watched him with growing terror. "Please, Mr. Donovan," he said, "look at the files. They prove Monica is the criminal." Donovan lowered his wrist. "You can hand those directly to the founder," he said. Jason froze. Thomas looked toward the side door. Barbara straightened in her chair, preparing to greet the person she still believed would confirm her son's promotion. Ashley stared at Jason as though she were finally seeing the truth beneath every promise he had made. At that exact moment, the heavy glass doors opened. I stepped through the heavy glass doors with a quiet authority that instantly commanded the massive room. I was not alone. Flanking me was a team of 4 elite forensic accountants dressed in immaculate dark suits, carrying thick briefcases filled with undeniable absolute proof. The rhythmic clicking of my leather stilettos against the polished hardwood floor echoed sharply, bouncing off the floor-to-ceiling windows. I did not look at my mother, whose face was frozen in a mask of pure aristocratic outrage. I did not look at my father, who was clutching the edge of the mahogany table, as if the floor beneath him had suddenly turned to liquid. I bypassed Jason entirely, walking past his trembling form and his miserable cardboard box without giving him a single glance. I moved with slow, deliberate precision, making my way directly to the far end of the boardroom. I pulled back the heavy black leather chair at the absolute head of the massive mahogany table and sat down. My accounting team immediately took their positions, standing silently behind me like an impenetrable wall of corporate armor. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that precedes a massive storm. Jason turned his head, slowly tracing my path with wide, terrified eyes. His skin had gone completely ghost white, making the nervous sweat on his forehead glisten under the bright, recessed lighting. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He simply stared at me, sitting in the seat of power, a position he had spent his entire pathetic life trying to steal. Beside him, Ashley was clutching her designer handbag so tightly her knuckles were stark white, her gaze darting wildly between my tailored suit and Donovan standing nearby. Donovan moved with practiced grace. He stepped away from the center of the room and walked toward my end of the table, stopping just to my right. He buttoned his suit jacket, smoothed his tie, and swept his sharp professional gaze over my stunned family members. He did not look like a man entertaining a prank. He looked like an executioner reading a final sentence. "Ladies and gentlemen," Donovan said, his rich voice cutting through the thick tension like a freshly sharpened blade. "Please allow me to officially introduce you to the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Acquisitions." He extended a respectful hand in my direction. "Monica." The reality of his words hit the table like a physical explosion. The carefully constructed delusions my family had lived in for decades instantly, completely shattered. Thomas let out a sharp, choking sound, gripping his chest, as he collapsed back into his chair. Ashley let out a small, terrified whimper, shrinking away from Jason, as if he had suddenly caught a contagious disease. Jason looked as though all the blood had been violently drained from his body. His jaw slacked, his eyes bulging with an incomprehensible mix of horror and absolute defeat. He looked from Donovan to me and back again, his mind completely unable to process the total destruction of his corporate fantasy. But it was Barbara who broke first. She let out a loud, shrill laugh that bounced harshly against the glass walls. It was a chaotic, forced sound, completely devoid of genuine humor. "Oh, Donovan, you are quite the joker," Barbara gasped, waving a manicured hand in the air. "This is a very sick prank. I understand you are trying to teach Jason a lesson about humility before his promotion, but this has gone far enough. You can drop the act now. Monica is just a desperate, bitter girl who works out of a tiny apartment. She does not own anything, let alone a billion-dollar holding company. Now please tell my son what his new title is so we can all go celebrate." I did not smile. I did not offer her the dignity of a verbal response. I simply opened my leather briefcase and pulled out my silver tablet. With a single deliberate swipe of my finger, I activated the boardroom presentation system. The massive digital screen covering the entire back wall hummed to life, casting a cool blue glow over my family's pale faces. My lead forensic accountant, a tall woman with severe glasses, stepped forward and handed me a small remote. I pressed a button, and a series of highly detailed complex financial flowcharts materialized on the massive screen. "What is this?" Jason stammered, his voice cracking, pitching upward in a humiliating squeak. "These are fake. I gave you the real logs. You cannot do this. You are framing me." I ignored his pathetic, stammering protests. I kept my posture perfectly straight, projecting total, uncompromising authority. I pressed another button on the remote, and the flowchart zoomed in, focusing on the specific massive accounting anomalies the federal auditors had flagged. The room was bathed in the harsh light of the undeniable evidence. I watched the charts illuminate the exact precise path of the stolen money, mapping out the complex digital footprint Jason had desperately tried to bury. The screen displayed the intricate web of dummy corporations in Delaware that my brilliant accounting team had painstakingly unraveled over the past 24 hours. But the final destination of the stolen funds was the true masterpiece of this presentation. The bright red lines on the flowchart clearly, undeniably traced the entire $2.5 million directly from the Vanguard corporate accounts straight into Jason's hidden offshore bank accounts, specifically designated for his lavish honeymoon and extravagant new lifestyle. The funds completely bypassed my dormant limited liability company, utterly destroying the fraudulent narrative he had just attempted to sell Donovan. My mother stopped laughing. The forced mirth evaporated from her face, leaving behind a hollow mask of pure shock. She stared at the glowing screen, reading the undeniable digital timestamps and the verified routing numbers. Thomas leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished mahogany table, his eyes scanning the detailed banking records with growing horror. He was a businessman. He knew exactly what a federal wire fraud trail looked like, and he was currently staring directly at a flawless, undeniably perfect prosecution file. Ashley covered her mouth with both hands, letting out a stifled sob as she saw the name of their luxury resort listed in the fraudulent expense column. Her dream wedding was funded by massive corporate theft. Jason tried to stand up, but his legs refused to support his weight. He collapsed back into his black leather chair, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. The cardboard box containing his miserable personal belongings sat near his expensive leather shoes, a silent reminder that he had already been stripped of everything. He looked at the two large security guards standing directly behind him, realizing for the first time that they were not there to escort him to a promotion. They were federal marshals waiting for my absolute command. I kept my eyes locked on the massive digital presentation, allowing the terrible reality of the situation to crush the last remaining fragments of their arrogant pride. The flawless steel trap was finally completely sprung. I looked back down the long length of the highly polished mahogany table at my terrified brother. His entire fake corporate world was officially reduced to digital ashes. I folded my hands together, perfectly still. It was time for him to pay. His absolute ruin was strictly guaranteed. Jason stared at the massive digital screen, with eyes so wide they looked like they might physically tear. He shook his head violently from side to side, desperately refusing to accept the undeniable reality glowing in bright red lines above him. "No," he stammered, his voice pitching into a shrill, hysterical register. "No, this is completely wrong. Those flowcharts are entirely fabricated. You are framing me, Monica. You hired these people to make fake documents. I gave Mr. Donovan the real financial logs just 10 minutes ago." He turned his frantic, pleading gaze toward Donovan and then toward his parents, trying to find a single sympathetic face in the freezing room. "Mom. Dad, you have to believe me. She is a liar. She has always been a bitter, jealous liar who wants to destroy everything I have built." Barbara immediately nodded, clutching her diamond necklace tightly against her chest. "She is forging this evidence, Thomas," she gasped, her voice trembling with manufactured aristocratic outrage. We need to call our lawyers right now. Do not let her do this to our son. Thomas opened his mouth to shout an objection, but I did not give him the chance to speak. I simply shifted my weight slightly in my heavy leather chair, keeping my posture completely relaxed and absolutely commanding. I raised my right hand and pressed a single small silver button on the presentation remote. The glowing flowcharts vanished from the massive digital screen, instantly replaced by a stark black background displaying a simple audio waveform. The sudden visual shift silenced my parents, but it was the crystal clear audio that subsequently pumped through the sophisticated boardroom ceiling speakers that completely paralyzed them. It was a flawless high-definition recording from the diner last week. The unmistakable sound of clinking silverware and background diner chatter filled the freezing boardroom perfectly, recreating the exact atmosphere of that miserable evening. Then my father's booming, arrogant voice echoed through the massive room. "You did perfectly," Jason Thomas's recorded voice declared, dripping with immense unearned pride. Moving that Vanguard money offshore was a brilliant maneuver. $2.5 million untraceable and totally secure. You are officially in the elite corporate sphere now, my boy. Just make sure the compliance team does not catch any lingering digital footprints before the transition. A second later, Jason's recorded voice responded, filled with smug, terrible confidence. "Do not worry about compliance, Dad," Jason's voice bragged over the speakers. "I routed the stolen funds through 3 separate shell companies in Delaware. The auditors will never find it. And even if they do, I have the ultimate insurance policy. Monica is completely clueless. I forced her to sign that fraudulent quitclaim deed tonight. She honestly believed she was signing a simple liability waiver. She has no idea she just surrendered her entire legal claim to the estate. We successfully forged grandfather's signature on the primary will last month, and now she has officially handed over her remaining rights. If Vanguard comes looking for their missing cash, I will just dump the fabricated financial logs in her lap and say she used the family estate money to fund the theft. It is the perfect crime." The audio recording clicked off, leaving a deafening absolute silence in its devastating wake. The digital waveform vanished from the screen, returning the room to its stark, terrifying reality. Ashley let out a horrifying, high-pitched sob and buried her face deep into her trembling hands. She realized she was marrying a federal criminal. Barbara looked as though she had been physically struck by lightning. Her mouth hung open in a grotesque, silent scream, her eyes darting back and forth between Jason and Thomas. The beautiful, glamorous illusion of her perfect family was disintegrating into dust right in front of her. Thomas tried to stand up, but his knees buckled instantly, forcing him back down into his heavy leather chair. He gripped his chest, fighting for air, realizing that his own voice had just condemned him to prison. He had gleefully participated in the destruction of his own father's legacy, and now the entire room had heard him proudly confess to the crime. Jason did not move. He was completely paralyzed, trapped in a state of catatonic terror. The arrogant smirk he had worn for 30 years was permanently erased, replaced by the horrifying realization that he had handed me the absolute weapon of his own destruction. I did not give them a single moment to recover or invent new lies. I smoothly opened my leather briefcase again, moving with slow, deliberate precision. I reached inside and retrieved a thick, beautiful document bound in heavy, dark blue cardstock. It was not a cheap imitation or a hasty copy. I placed it firmly onto the polished mahogany table and smoothly slid it down the long surface until it stopped directly in front of Thomas's shaking hands. "That is the original, legally authenticated will our grandfather filed securely with his private attorneys," I stated, my voice cutting through the freezing air like a sharpened blade. "He never intended for you or Jason to inherit his commercial real estate portfolio. He knew exactly what kind of greedy, manipulative people you truly were." I paused, letting the absolute finality of my statement settle into their shattered minds. "The document you forged transferring his entire massive estate over to Jason was completely null and void from the very start. I am the sole legal executor of his estate. and the sole beneficiary of his commercial properties. The quitclaim deed you cornered me into signing at the diner last week was entirely fraudulent. You thought you were cleverly forcing me to surrender my inheritance, but you were actually generating the physical documentation needed to ensure your own absolute ruin. You handed me the murder weapon with your fingerprints perfectly preserved all over it. Thomas stared blindly at the blue cardstock cover, reading the notarized stamps verifying its authenticity. He opened his mouth but could only produce a weak, pathetic wheeze. Barbara buried her face in her hands, crying hysterically as her glorious high society dreams collapsed into an impending criminal nightmare. The realization of their profound stupidity crushed them. I leaned forward, resting my elbows lightly on the table. My voice grew dangerously quiet, filling the room with terrifying calm. Submitting that completely forged quitclaim deed to illegally acquire the family estate was an incredibly bold move, I whispered, staring directly into Jason's horrified eyes. But presenting that same fraudulent document here today in an attempt to actively cover up a massive corporate embezzlement scheme is significantly worse. You did not just steal from your family, Jason. You deliberately engaged in a highly documented, premeditated financial crime. By submitting that forged quitclaim deed through digital banking channels, you and Thomas officially committed federal wire fraud. Jason recoiled from the polished table, gasping for air. His elaborately constructed fantasy of unearned wealth shattered into jagged pieces. Thomas began to weep, realizing their monumental failure. Ashley stood up violently, pushing her heavy chair away. I kept my face entirely devoid of emotion, refusing them any sympathy. I raised my hand, pointing deliberately past their trembling bodies toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the room. I think it is time we officially conclude this transition meeting, I stated flatly. The two quiet men, standing patiently in the shadows, stepped forward. They were not Vanguard security guards, they were federal agents. The men moved with the synchronized precision of law enforcement professionals who had executed this exact maneuver 1,000 times before. As they stepped fully into the harsh fluorescent lighting of the boardroom, they simultaneously reached into their jacket pockets and produced dark leather wallets, flipping them open to reveal silver federal badges. Special Agent Miller and Special Agent Davies, the taller of the two, announced, his voice entirely devoid of the corporate deference Jason was used to commanding. The metallic clinking of handcuffs being unclipped from a tactical belt echoed sharply, bouncing off the floor-to-ceiling glass walls. The sound was incredibly distinct. It was the sound of absolute finality. Ashley stared at the silver cuffs glinting under the lights, and something inside her finally snapped. The perfectly maintained illusion of her high society future completely evaporated, leaving behind the terrifying reality of her present situation. She looked at Jason, the man she had sworn to love and cherish just weeks prior. He was not a powerful vice president. He was a fraud, a thief, and a soon-to-be convicted felon facing years in a federal penitentiary. The lavish honeymoon, the designer clothes, the sprawling suburban mansion they had toured were all funded by stolen corporate assets that were currently frozen by the federal government. She was married to a man who had absolutely nothing left except massive legal liabilities and impending prison time. Ashley did not scream or cry or berate him. The sheer magnitude of the disaster demanded complete silence. She slowly stood up from her black leather chair, her movements stiff and robotic. She looked down at her left hand, where a massive diamond engagement ring and a diamond-encrusted wedding band rested. She reached over with her right hand and deliberately slid both rings off her finger. The metal scraped softly against her skin. She placed the rings directly onto the polished mahogany table, letting them rest next to the fake digital routing logs Jason had tried to use to frame me. She picked up her designer handbag, turned on her heel, and walked directly toward the heavy glass doors. Jason called out to her, his voice a pathetic croak, but she did not stop. She did not even look back. The heavy doors swung shut behind her, leaving a void in the room that perfectly mirrored Jason's empty future. Watching his wife abandon him was the final blow that shattered Jason's remaining mental defenses. The severe reality of the federal agents closing in on him stripped away every ounce of arrogance he had ever possessed. His legs simply gave out beneath him. He collapsed, sliding off the expensive leather chair and hitting the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. He crawled forward on his hands and knees, completely disregarding his tailored suit and the remaining shreds of his dignity. He stopped just short of my end of the massive table, his hands gripping the edge of the mahogany wood as he looked up at me. "Monica, please!" he begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, hysterical sob. "Please do not do this to me. You cannot let them take me away. I will do anything you want. I will give you the money back. I will sign whatever documents you put in front of me. I will work for you for free for the rest of my life. Just tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them it was a corporate accounting error that we are resolving internally." I sat perfectly still, looking down at him from the absolute head of the table. The forensic accountants behind me remained silent sentinels, observing his complete breakdown with professional detachment. "We are family, Monica." Jason pleaded, tears streaming down his pale cheeks, dripping onto the floor. "You are my sister. You know I never meant for things to go this far. Dad pushed me into the will forgery, and the embezzlement just spiraled out of control. I was under so much pressure to perform. You know how they are. You know how hard it is to please them. Please, Monica, just this once. Just cover for me this one single time, and I swear to God I will disappear. I will leave Vanguard and I will never bother you again. Please have mercy on your own blood." I looked down at him coldly, taking in the pathetic sight of the golden boy, reduced to a weeping mess on the corporate floor. I felt no mercy, no guilt, and absolutely no familial obligation. "You told everyone at your wedding I was a loser." I stated, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "Now I am the loser who owns your debt, your house, and your freedom." The federal agent stepped forward immediately, grabbing Jason by his arms and hauling him roughly to his feet. He offered no physical resistance, his body entirely limp as they pulled his arms behind his back. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, securing his ultimate fate. "Jason Adam Sterling, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit forgery," Agent Davies declared, his strong voice filling the painfully quiet room. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Do you understand these rights as I have read them to you?" Jason did not answer at all. He just sobbed uncontrollably, his head hanging low in absolute disgrace. The two agents turned him around firmly and marched him out of the boardroom, leaving my parents to sit alone with the complete devastation of their ruined legacy. I watched them cry, realizing I was finally completely free of the toxic hold they had over me for my entire life, and I had never felt so incredibly powerful before. The immediate aftermath of Jason being hauled away left a lingering vacuum inside the freezing boardroom. Thomas and Barbara remained frozen in their leather seats, staring blankly at the empty space where their golden boy had just suffered his ultimate downfall. I did not give them a single moment to mourn their shattered delusions. My legal team stepped forward, placing thick stacks of documented evidence folders directly in front of my terrified parents. The trap had perfectly closed on Jason, but the snare for my parents was just locking into place. Thomas had proudly admitted on that crystal-clear diner audio recording that he orchestrated the forgery of our grandfather's original will. Barbara had willingly participated as an official witness to the fraudulent quitclaim deed. By deliberately signing those damning documents, they had legally implicated themselves in a massive federal conspiracy. My lead forensic accountant coldly informed them that Vanguard Acquisitions was formally seizing all their personal financial assets to cover damages and replace the stolen trust funds. They tried desperately to fight back, but their expensive lawyers took one look at the undeniable audio evidence and immediately advised them to surrender everything to avoid going to federal prison. Within exactly 2 agonizing weeks, The massive suburban mansion they had proudly flaunted for decades was completely foreclosed upon by the banks. The luxury vehicles, the exclusive country club memberships, and the vast designer wardrobes were entirely liquidated. My parents were abruptly forced to downsize, moving all their miserable remaining possessions into a tiny, run-down apartment located on the absolute worst side of the city. Their glamorous high society friends, the wealthy neighbors they had desperately tried to impress, instantly turned their judgmental backs on them. Those exact same elite country club executives sat comfortably in their opulent living rooms, watching the evening news as the massive Vanguard embezzlement scandal vividly unfolded on national television. Barbara and Thomas instantly became complete pariahs, entirely ostracized from the golden world they valued above their own daughter. There was no dramatic, tearful reconciliation. There was zero heartwarming moment where my ruined parents finally recognized my worth and genuinely apologized for their decades of abuse. Exactly 1 month after the boardroom confrontation, my cell phone vibrated on my desk. I looked at the screen and saw my mother's name flashing. I answered the call, keeping my breathing steady and calm. Barbara did not offer a greeting. She immediately launched into a frantic, hysterical sobbing fit. She begged me for financial help, crying about how their tiny apartment was infested with cockroaches and complaining how Thomas was struggling to find a job because his banking license had been revoked. She pleaded with me, claiming that family was supposed to forgive each other when financial times got tough. I listened to her crying for 2 minutes, letting her exhaust her tactics. I felt absolutely nothing. The well of yearning I used to carry for her maternal approval was totally dry. "Barbara," I stated calmly, my flat voice effortlessly cutting straight through her loud, hysterical sobs with absolute freezing surgical precision. "The heavily toxic family system of mutual abuse that you and Thomas actively built is officially permanently terminated. You both made your terrible choices, and you willingly prioritized a completely fabricated, wealthy image over your very own children. You are entirely, completely responsible for the severe consequences of those awful decisions. Do not ever call or contact me again." I did not patiently wait for her to pathetically respond or suddenly launch into another predictably pathetic screaming guilt trip. I simply pulled the phone away from my ear and firmly hung up, permanently ending the final call. I immediately navigated straight to my phone settings and permanently, irrevocably deleted her personal contact information. Within 1 single hour, I had my dedicated personal assistant completely change my private cell phone number, entirely, forever severing the very last tiny remaining string that tied me to the utterly miserable, abusive shadows of my extremely dark past. I confidently walked away from my desk and stepped through the heavy sliding glass doors of my gorgeous new residence. The cool, crisp evening breeze immediately swept gently over me, pleasantly carrying the faint, energetic ambient sounds of the bustling metropolis far below. I calmly walked directly to the edge of the incredibly expansive private terrace of my $14 million penthouse, leaning gently against the thick, sturdy glass railing. I peacefully looked out directly over the gorgeously glowing, sprawling city skyline, feeling an incredibly profound sense of peace finally settle deeply into my exhausted, weary bones. The massively sprawling, gorgeous urban landscape sparkled with millions of bright, beautiful, colorful lights stretching out wonderfully endlessly as far as the human eye could possibly perceive. I was absolutely no longer the sad, forgotten spinster sister silently hiding in the dark corner of a massive grand ballroom. I was now the brilliant, absolute master architect of my very own incredible, powerful destiny. The wonderful sound of warm, genuine, happy laughter beautifully drifted out from the massive living room directly behind me. I slowly turned my head and smiled softly. I was certainly not alone in this massively beautiful, luxurious space. I was joyfully, happily surrounded by my true, genuine, deeply chosen family. My truly brilliant co-founders, my incredibly supportive, dedicated team, and the intensely loyal friends who had actively, bravely stood by me when I had absolutely nothing were all happily gathered safely together, joyously celebrating our massive, undeniable success. Donovan smoothly stepped out onto the balcony, holding two heavy crystal glasses, generously filled with incredibly expensive vintage champagne. He politely handed one directly to me with a deep, incredibly respectful smile, silently acknowledging the incredibly difficult, massive journey we had just successfully conquered completely together. I slowly raised my beautiful glass toward the brilliantly glittering, beautiful evening city skyline. I was finally permanently building a massive corporate empire, entirely on my own uncompromising terms, completely free from the toxic shadows of my past. Life often teaches us that our true value is never determined by those who constantly underestimate us. Sometimes the most painful betrayals come from the people who are supposed to protect and love us unconditionally, our own family. You might spend years trapped in a toxic dynamic, trying to earn the approval of parents who favor a golden child while treating you as a disappointment or an outcast. However, the greatest lesson you can learn is that you do not need their validation to build a meaningful and successful life. When you are pushed to your lowest point, you have a choice. You can either surrender to their cruel expectations, or you can use that pain as fuel to quietly build your own independent strength and security. True empowerment comes from recognizing your own potential when no one else does, and protecting your peace by setting firm, unapologetic boundaries against those who exploit you. Walking away from a toxic environment is not an act of selfishness. It is a vital step toward profound self-respect and necessary healing. As you reclaim your destiny, you will discover that family is not solely defined by shared DNA. Genuine family consists of the people who actually show up for you during your darkest moments, who celebrate your victories without jealousy, and who entirely respect your boundaries. Your ultimate success and authentic happiness will ultimately serve as the perfect closure to your past. This incredible journey from deep betrayal to absolute triumph proves beyond doubt that your true value comes solely from within. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic environment to finally find your true worth? Please share your own journey of courage and resilience in the comments below, and do not forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons